Good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for being here. I think we can get started as people continue to filter in. I am Melissa Bell. I'm a correspondent at CNN based in Paris, but delighted to be here in Doha for the first time. As a network, we've been partners for a long time. Personally, this is a first, and I'm really pleased to be here and delighted to be in such wonderful company. We have a really interesting panel today on the question of energy security, um, energy supplies, economic stability, how you can ensure both in these very difficult and increasingly, it seems, turbulent times. And there doesn't seem to be any end to the turbulence at all. And I'd like to introduce very briefly my panelists. First of all, immediately to my left, Alibek Kuantirov, who is the economy minister of Kazakhstan. To his left immediately, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovic, the former president of Croatia. And immediately to her left, Victor Gao, who probably knows more about energy than almost anyone here at this conference combined. We're delighted to have you with us. And just on the more specifics, Mr. Gao, I'll give you more details precisely. You are the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, but also the Chairman of the China Energy Security Agency, also an advisor to Saudi Aramco. So we're delighted to have your very important knowledge. And if I may start with you, Mr. Gao, first of all, just because it's topical, happening now, and it seems to me fascinating what's happening in Dubai as the world seeks the first ever commitment on the end of the use of fossil fuels in 30 years, and OPEC countries rebel against the thought. What are your views on whether it's achievable and the COP28 will come up with anything at all? It seems to me that it's crunch time.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Again, I'm very honored to attend the Doha Forum. I'm also the chairman of China Energy Security Institute, focusing on energy as widely defined and security as extensively defined. I would say for any country in the world, achieving energy security is a must. And any government which does not achieve energy security for its people is failing in its responsibilities. Now, for China, achieving energy security and also energy security in terms of affordability, sustainability, safety, security, you name it, is a must. In that sense, for example, our great neighboring country, Kazakhstan, becomes a very important country because Kazakhstan is not only a supply of oil to China, but also is very important transit country from gas from Turkmenistan all the way to China. In that sense, China looks at the world in one way to balance its energy needs and also to achieve sustainability of its energy supply. You know, China depends on imported oil up to about 75%. China depends on imported gas up to about 45%. My personal forecast is that China's dependence on imported gas will eventually also reach about 70 to 75%. And I'm grateful that Qatar has been a very important supplier of gas to China. Now, you mentioned COP28. I think the fact that the Chinese Special Envoy, Mr. Xie Zhenhua, and the US Special Envoy, John Kerry, walked in together, almost hands in hand, is really a very important symbol that in dealing with the climate change consequences, China-US cooperation will be a must. After all, these two are the two largest users of energy of all kinds, the two largest emitters, and if they do not get onto the same page, I think mankind will probably be doomed. And I think I would really give gratitude and appreciation to Mr. Xie Zhenhua of China, whom we all personally know, and also John Kerry of the United States for taking the important initiative of promoting cooperation between China and the United States, overcoming all the difficulties and all the odds to demonstrate to mankind as a whole that despite of all the difficulties, China and the United States can actually cooperate to the extent possible. And China-US cooperation in dealing with the consequences of climate change is not just for the good or the benefit of the Chinese people or the American people, but for mankind as a whole. Allow me to mention one very brief point. When mankind started to focus on climate change, I actually thought finally we found a topic that mankind can unite. But unfortunately, over the past few years, we know division about climate change actually is deepening. And I think we need to promote cooperation. Thank you very much.
I think that's a really interesting point. We'll come back to that in just a moment, and specifically China's role in that transition. Madam President, perhaps to you, Victor Gao mentions division at a time when we should be seeking unity. But of course, that is true geopolitically and not just on issues of climate. And that's something we've seen increase Ukraine and Gaza more recently. How does a country like the one that you run uh, deal with those geopolitical shifts that are so decisive for their energy dependence? Croatia imports about 53% of its energy supplies. How do you prepare for that, deal with it, face it?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to be here. And let me just begin by saying that, as President of Croatia, just to go back to your initial question, when speaking before the UN, I often call climate change a weapon of mass destruction. I truly believe that it is one of the primary challenges that the humankind, that the global community is dealing with, and that we have to overcome our ideological or any other geopolitical differences in order to be able to deal with such an issue. And I very much welcome what Professor Gao has said about Chinese and US renewed cooperation on climate change and several other issues that are of global importance and that should be of concern to all of us. By the way, I was the person who signed the UN Convention on Climate Change on behalf of Croatia, and I truly believe in it. And thinking back of last summer, and thinking of many situations when I went to war zones and actually lived through the war in Croatia, and the extreme weather events that we have over the summer due to the fact that it was one of the hottest summers ever, that you can be killed by a tree in the city center of Zagreb, which is being pulled out by a storm cell that has developed quite unexpectedly. And having had so many events over the summer like that, I am quite concerned by the divisions that I see coming out of COP28, out of Dubai, and the controversies, because definitely fossil fuels are one of the main causes of the rise in temperature. So Croatia, as a member state of the European Union, obviously, first and foremost, wants to use the power of the European Union, and the EU wants to be at the forefront of combating climate change, leading the world to deal with climate change, to keep the temperature rise below 1.5% as the Fit for 55 program describes, to stick to the Paris agreement, and to reduce the greenhouse emissions by 55% by 2030 and become climate neutral by 2050. So these are all our goals and ambitions. Now, looking at Croatia, of course, we're facing specific difficulties. One of them is import of energy. Second is outdated infrastructure, which we can touch upon a little bit later when we talk about regional cooperation. Then regulation, and of course, the market prices, the great disruptors that we have seen beginning with COVID-19 and then with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we work within the country in order to build the infrastructure to diversify the energy mix, but also, again, use the power of the European Union, especially in the context of EU's climate and energy diplomacy with the rest of the world, to help us negotiate the prices of energy in order to achieve more energy independence and diversification.
I think just to pick up Minister Kuyantirov on where Kalinda just left off, Madam President just left off, the idea uh, of union, how alliances are crucial, for instance, in rethinking one's energy mix, energy dependency. Within the European Union for Croatia, for instance. And I'd like to take the example of Kazakhstan, which is fascinating. You are, on one hand, a member of the Commonwealth of Independent States, close still to Russia, a member also of the Belts and Roads Initiative, Beijing. How do you use alliances in a way that is constructive for your national needs whilst avoiding the pitfalls of too much proximity at times of difficulty, as what we've seen over the last couple of years with Russia?
Thank you. Thank you, Melinda, for your question. Good afternoon, everyone, distinguished panelists, guests. Uh, it has been a difficult time recently after the post-COVID, in the post-COVID era, when the situation in Ukraine started, and especially we had some repercussions in Kazakhstan, since we are a landlocked country and most basically went through the territory of Russia, and most of our oil also went through the Caspian pipeline, CPC. Now we are finding alternative routes, and Mr. Gao mentioned our country as one of the oil suppliers. So this is one of the alternative routes is to to China, and also purchasing strategic assets like ports in Liuningan, in Xi'an, in the territory of China, and also it was a strategic decision to buy a uh, port in Georgia, in Batumi, many years ago, which was underused, but now it has been used to its full potential. And alternative routes is the middle corridor. So what the work that we should have done many years ago, now it's fully being implemented, and of course we need more technological development assistance. But using these alliances, both economic, political, geographical, and alliances, is for our good. We are the largest landlocked country in the world, so there are some difficulties, there are some challenges, but at the same time there are opportunities. We look at all of these situations as opportunities. Even the last year, since the situation, unfortunate situation, we are a peaceful nation against war, we have been trying to reap some fruits from this situation for the sake of our people and for the sake of our region. Because Kazakhstan is a provider, is not only a provider of um, uh, energy balance and energy security, but also of food security, since with take into account the vast territories and also the potential, the environmentally friendly food products are being produced in our country. For example, together with we have projects with Persian Gulf countries, including Qatar. So these are all directed at, I mean, noble projects. They are all directed at building a secure world in our region, though of course it's difficult. And that's why we also need to understand the advantages that, for example, our country can provide to other countries and unions, including the European Union. And we've been working, we are on a fast track with the European Union um, on Global Gate initiative, and we should look at natural resources not as a curse, but it's a potential. It's a resources that have been given to us by the Almighty, by the nature, and we should use them wisely for the sake of our nations and to secure this, or to secure the in our case the continent. That is why our nation, our country, so is ready to further work with our partners, with our foreign partners, including with large economies, European Union, China, United States, and others, in order to secure the situation, especially in the oil and gas sphere.
It's fascinating that you should refer to it sometimes as a curse. It's interesting how often energy supplies can ultimately prove to turn up more as a curse than a gift. I'd like to turn to the question of transition. Of course, you mentioned. You just mentioned the aim, and of course, Mr. Gao, Victor, you mentioned as well. The idea, of course, ultimately is that consumers can access the needs uh, that they have for the winter months. We'll talk about the Central Asian paradox if we may in a moment. The difficulty there is sometimes to bring energy to those who need it. And China is another example of a country that has recently announced that it was changing its carbon rules, upping its coal supply just to make sure it can get energy to the people. This is, of course, against the idea of the transition that we all seek.
Allow me to add a point. I listened very carefully to what His Excellency the Minister had to say. According to my personal analysis, Kazakhstan should be classified as a quasi-coastal country. Why? Because while it is important to maintain all your relations with countries to your west, on your east is China. And within China, almost all the highways, high-speed railways, airports, pipelines, etc., have been building up from the China-Kazakhstan borderline all the way to the Chinese coastline. Therefore, if something can be done between China and Kazakhstan on a systematic and institutional level, I think Kazakhstan should be considered as a quasi or semi-coastal country because you will have the benefits of all these already established and well-functioning infrastructure projects to your east. And further, I think China's demand for oil and gas from Kazakhstan and countries to your west probably will be long lasting for many decades to come. Therefore, I think we need to be very creative. Kazakhstan, to my best understanding, is not a landlocked country in the middle of Eurasian continent, furthest away from the coastline. The coastline should be just by your doorstep. Thank you.
On the question, though, Mr. Gao, of the energy transition, the difficulty is that for now, getting in these difficult times, the volatile times that we're talking about, with energy prices high and the volatility great, in order for countries, and you mentioned it is a strategic imperative, it's their job to make sure that energy is available to everybody. Sacrifices are made in terms of targets of the transition that we seek in order for short-term supplies. And that's exactly the place where China is right now as the biggest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. It is nonetheless going to be emitting more.
China need to do a better job in terms of fastly achieving carbon neutrality and zero carbon going forward. But allow me to use this opportunity attending the Doha Forum to make an appeal. I think we, mankind together, should make a carve out for international cooperation with regard to new and renewable sources of energy. We should not allow any country to politicize these solar, wind, or new resources of other kinds. We should have strategic carve-outs so that international community should really cooperate as far as possible for these new and renewable sources of energy, because eventually mankind probably will be doomed if no actions or no sufficient actions will be taken in dealing with the consequences of climate change. The time is now. We can no longer wait. And in this regard, it's very fortunate to see that China is the most important country in terms of wind and solar power, not only in terms of R&D, equipment manufacturing, and also deployment of these new and renewable sources of energy. And China is willing to share its expertise and manufacturing capacities, for example, setting up new free trade zones, etc., with all the other countries in the world. And no country should block such international cooperation, because the more we cooperate, the better, and mankind will be better off eventually.
I'd like to come back to the idea of that cooperation specifically with between Beijing and Washington. On that question, Madam President, of renewable energies, that one of the difficulties when you deal with energy policy, and this is to both of you perhaps, is that you're dealing with the very local infrastructure that's been there for a long time, that is very expensive to fix, to change, to transform. You're doing it from the bottom up. Even if you have the European Union, in the case of Croatia, driving it, helping it, furthering it, these are initiatives that need to happen at a very local level at a time when we should be thinking very globally, and that's at the heart of the difficulty.
Yes, of course. And connecting that into energy grids is one of the major challenges. When I think about countries like Croatia, for us, as a country that is not big in geography or the number of people, obviously regional and international cooperation is very important. And it is important to be able to assist each other. Solidarity, after all, is one of the underlying principles of the European Union. But we have also been working in the neighborhood in Southeast Europe by integrating energy markets through Central and Southeastern Europe energy connectivity. And also, back when I was president with President Duda of Poland, in 2015, we started an initiative that is called the Three Seas Initiative, connecting the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Black Seas. And we focus on three pillars of infrastructure: transportation, digitalization, and energy infrastructure, which is incredibly important for our countries, being the backbone actually of European security and resilience. So, energy security also equals not just economic stability, but also security, overall security of countries in general. We have seen situations where, due to disruptions, such as in 2009 with the gas supplies with Russia and Ukraine, not only our economies suffered, but our societies suffered as well. Energy prices can be used as coercive force, and they literally brought down some governments because they create social unrest and an overall increase in the cost or the price of living. So shifting to renewables is not easy. There is a lot of investment that is needed, and now compounded with the fact that after the 24th of February of 2022, there was a huge disruption in the supply of gas and oil from Russia to the European Union and to European countries. This has added to the difficulties that we have been experiencing in our plans to shift to renewables. Croatia has generally been able to keep up with European goals of the percentage of renewable energy as part of the whole energy output. But now the situation of the disruption with Russia and the fact that many countries, some of them depended on Russia for up to 50% of imports of gas. Uh, the European Union came up with the EU energy platform and Repower EU plan, which, as a matter of fact, combines investing into renewable energy sources, but also into traditional carbon, such as gas, in particular LNG gas. And this is where Qatar has been an exceptionally important partner for the EU. I think last year Qatar came second or third when it comes to exports of LNG into the European Union. And as part of the Three Seas initiative, but as part of the initiative to bring about connections and reverse flow connectors to be able to deliver energy to our neighbors, including all the way to Ukraine. We started with the plans in 2015 to build LNG terminals across Central Europe, from Swinoujście in Poland and Klaipėda in the Baltics to Krk in the Adriatic, and to connect them to be able to provide energy to each other. And because of that, for instance, the import of foreign goods in Croatia last year increased exponentially, mostly due to imports of LNG gas. However, at the same time, we continue with efforts to invest into, in particular, solar and wind, but also biomass, and looking ahead, trying to align with the EU ambition to produce hydrogen power.
But of course, you remind us, Madam President, that whilst the energy crisis in Europe has been seen as like as an opportunity, in a sense, for pursuing renewables, the fact that it's having to happen so quickly and in such a crisis
Yes,
is part of the difficulty.
the transition had to happen basically overnight. I mean,
Course.
again, we're going back to a mix. However, everybody is investing into renewables. And I've heard a lot of people say that, as a matter of fact, this crisis will accelerate this transition to renewables and to green economies. Of course, it very much depends on other geopolitical circumstances. And when we look at energy, it's not just the source and diversification, it's also the security of supply, supply chains, the availability, and of course, the prices, affordability by leaving no one behind is what matters.
We,
But for way too long, I think for some countries in Europe, energy was too much driven by commercial implications, by commercial prices, rather than looking at geopolitical circumstances. And for me, energy has always been one of those elements that defines the security and the stability of any country.
of course, and yet driven by commercial interests historically, which is another of the difficulties. But which leads me neatly back to Minister Kantarov. I'd like to ask you about that Central Asian paradox, which I think picks up nicely from where Madam President just left off. The idea that you are big oil producers, as Victor Gao pointed out earlier. You are a huge transition point for Russian natural gas supplies as well. But even as a net producer of energy, you are still, it is still difficult to get energy to the people who need it. And that's something that Central Asian countries share. It's to do with infrastructure, it's to do with endemic corruption, it's to do with prices. The incentives are to export, not to keep your supplies inside the country. And even in Kazakhstan, people have found themselves in desperate energy situations just these last few months. So how do you how do you fix that? How do you at a national level ensure that your own energy supplies get to the people who need them?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. Even being an oil-rich country and resources-rich country is also a challenge, as I said. So we should treat natural resources as a comparative advantage, but we should use them wisely. And it really takes a great political commitment to decide to go carbon neutral, as our country did. We were the first country in Central Asia to adopt the strategy of carbon neutrality by 2060. Still, we really depend on the coal. So our energy balance consists of 69% of it's a coal energy. Though, of course, we do understand that we in the coming decades we will have to lower the emissions multifold, and we should do that not in the way just by closing coal mines or other mines. We should do that in a different way because we have more than 30,000 workers working in the coal industry. But there is a great example of Poland, for example, which made a transformation process with its coal mines, and also we have other examples. I think, and especially since we have mono cities, single enterprises on which whole cities depend with thousands of workers that we cannot just close down. So it will be a natural process. Some people, some workers will retire, some will be re-educated, but using these coal or other minerals, I think it should be done, by filtering, by offsetting, by applying additional measures in order to lower the emissions and still use the resources. We are doing it in several ways, and one of the way is to lower carbon emissions from the energy sector. Another direction is doing the same from non-energy sector, and the third direction is also absorption. through forestation, through other measures, and also increasing the energy efficiency. Unfortunately, we cannot go 100% renewable in our country. Like, for example, today in Astana, Astana is the second coldest capital in the world. It's minus 28 degrees. Here in Qatar, it's plus 28 degrees. So it will be difficult in using current technologies to store the renewable energy. So this is just impossible at the moment. But at the same time, we also keep in mind that in the coming decades, so there might be new technologies that we could use later. But at the same time, of course, every country has to has its own unique way how to go carbon neutral. It's not only about one country, because if we do this commitment, or some other country also does, but all all others around will not do this. So official borders will not just keep their emissions or our emissions and just keep them on our territory. This is the global situation, and it really matters. It really matters, and we all of us, I think, feel the global warming issue. Like, for example, the negative temperatures that we were expecting usually in October in our capital. So it just came this week, quite 1.5 months later. So this is very abnormal this year, and I think going carbon neutral is it must be a target for every country, even for those some countries will come to it later, but we should help doing that, and we should also try to educate some portions of the nation of other nations, like in our country, of businesses, to get used to these new commitments, because in our country people and businesses are just got used to very low tariffs, very low. They do not understand, and they don't want to understand how Europe pays so much money on energy, on heating. So because it's even impossible to think about it. But we will have to change the situation, because we do not want just to be accommodating on the natural resources that we are having, but we must increase the value added economically and also provide uh, energy security on the continent.
Um, Victor Gao, on that question, I think exactly what you just mentioned, Minister, about each country is going to seek to get that carbon. We're going to open up questions in a minute, by the way. Just very briefly, though, to finish on that. The idea that each country will get to that carbon neutrality in its own way. Let's take the Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. It has implications, for instance, for China's critical minerals, for instance, and electric vehicle hopes. And this is presumably what you were referring to a moment ago. Each country's attempt to get to its own carbon neutrality in a way that is economically sustainable is going to have an impact on the economies of other countries and their attempts to get to carbon neutrality. And this was, I guess, your point, Mr. Gao, about needing to make it a global initiative rather than a national one, and yet it will remain a national one for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. I think every country and each country need to adopt its own policy in dealing with the climate change impact. Allow me to make a brief comment about where we are now, the Middle East or the Gulf region. There is plentiful supply of solar energy here. The key is how to tap into it. I would appeal that China, US, Europe, and other countries cooperate and work closely with the Arab countries so that eventually you will achieve a very higher level of solar power. And you can sell your oil and gas for more wealth of your own people. So it's a good trade-off. Develop very aggressively the solar power, which is abundant in this part of the world, and then achieve greater wealth by exporting more of your crude oil and natural gas. How you can make that major breakthrough? How can you really bring it up to economy of scale? You have to promote international cooperation. That's why I personally advocate no more politicizing, no more geopolitical sizing uh, international cooperation as far as new and renewable sources of energy. Now, if we can really cooperate internationally, I'm pretty sure countries in this part of the world can easily achieve economy of scale in utilizing solar power. So every country is different, every region is different. The key is how we can identify a roadmap and encourage international cooperation to achieve the best result for that country or for that region.
But doesn't precisely the issues in Dubai, don't they precisely show us how difficult that is?
Indeed, right now, I think the roadblock to international cooperation is that there are some countries which do not want to follow the uh, equal but differentiated approach in dealing with the climate change impact. Because I think the vast majority of the countries in the global south still need to develop, but they also need to achieve their climate change goals. For example, how do you reconcile these two competing goals, and how the developed countries can really help the developing countries to achieve their goals? And I would say eventually we will be better off if we realize that there will be no national walls behind which we can hide when the consequences of climate change really take a bite on mankind. And I would even say that mankind or Homo sapiens are facing with two existential threats right now. One is the consequences of climate change, and the other one is the runaway development of AI, because human beings or Homo sapiens are facing these two extreme threats. And if we do not get our acts together, it may be too late. We may be overwhelmed by AI, or we may be taken over by this climate change impact. So it is now that all of us need to talk about international cooperation rather than politicizing international cooperation in dealing with climate change, and international regulation of AI rather than ignoring the rapid change in the AI revolution.
That is fascinating. Even as we bicker amongst ourselves, the world changes perhaps beyond our control. I'd love to open it up to questions to anyone who has any for any of our panelists. I think a microphone can be brought to you.
Thank you. Uh, my name is Dr. Slim Fariani. I'm the CEO of the Djibouti Sovereign Wealth Fund. So small but beautiful country. Prior to that, I was minister in Tunisia for renewable energy, etc. And prior to that, in the investment world in London. I think as global citizens, we all have a duty and responsibility to close the gap between the haves and have-nots. And Africa is among the have-nots. It's 54 countries. And we talk about a lot of cooperation. The developed world has developed. The developing world needs to develop, as you rightly mentioned. So the burden should not be on the developing world to do it on their own. Now, we've done it in Djibouti, Vision 2035. We're already at 50% of energy through wind. We embarked on solar, but small is beautiful. However, Africa is 1.5 billion. Another 53 countries need to do it. So I'm not sure how, because talk is cheap, and we hear a lot of talk, but there should be something specific, I believe, in my humble opinion, to Africa. Yes, there's 8 billion people out there, but that's 1.5 billion, growing by 300 million each decade. A lot of consumers, a lot of energy needs, and therefore I think special mention. I don't see Africa well represented, so I think I mention it wearing a vested interest to that continent. So I'll leave it to you, because I've heard a lot about that, but action is still not tangible.
I think that's an excellent question. Minister Kantarov, would you like to pick that up? The question of the inequality that has only been exacerbated by the crises of the last few years.
Thank you, sir. I think you raised a very crucial question about the African continent. As I mentioned, 54 nations, and we should look at it from, on the one hand, it's a very rich continent, very rich, and special praise should be given to the African potential. And at the same time, of course, we need to help. I mean, the developed countries should help the developing countries, including the International Financial Organization. That is why I think we should raise this issue both in African unions, at different regional platforms, and of course at such organizations like the World Bank, the UN, etc. So altogether, of course, the voice of each African nation is it must be heavy. And I can only comment that special attention should be given to the continent.
Any other questions? I think
Hi, everyone. My name is Shaylis Kiru, CEO and founder of Oculus Group, Oculus Consulting, a UK-based energy and utilities company. So I think first of all, thank you for your question earlier. I thought that was really nice of you hitting the nail in the head, because there seems to be a gap around that. However, I'm looking at it from a slightly different perspective, which is around, I hear the concern about we need resources, we need financing, we need money for the whole concept around renewable energy, which is very true. However, I don't seem to see much desire around the skill sets or expecting or sort of exporting that talent into regions. So obviously, considering I own a consulting firm, I'm keen to understand what avenues might be in place for bringing that wealth of knowledge, that wealth of experience we've sort of gathered delivering projects globally to regions like those of those you're from, if that makes any sense. Thank you.
Madam President, is that something you'd like to
Yes,
address?
absolutely. I mean, that is a crucial question. In addition to funding for transition itself, one has to have the knowledge base on how to do it and how to implement it. So I believe that part of that is assistance that the minister talked about from the IMF, from the World Bank, and others should also go into the development of the knowledge base and into meaningful consulting and advising. If I look at Croatia's position, we very much benefit, again, going back to the European Union, to the knowledge pool where the European Union brings together the industry, the academia, all the experts, not just on energy, but on market trends, on geopolitics, and where we all stand together also with another aspect that is crucial, and that is not to increase energy prices by divisions. And I will go back to what Professor Gao has been saying now. In dealing, one of the ways that we have been dealing with the latest crisis caused by the disruptions of Russia's war in Ukraine is not repeating the same mistake from COVID-19 when individual nations were trying to get the vaccine and then you had shortage, nationalism, inequity. So energy is another area which really produces a lot of inequalities, in particular in Africa and other parts of the world that are still developing. So for us, it's incredibly important to act together and to negotiate the prices and to look at the supply as well, so that the supply, the prices of supply do not soar like it happened in the initial phases after the invasion, that we put into force all mechanisms in order to be able to control that. And for every country, it's going to be very expensive to pay for that transition. We all have national plans. The EU is assisting us with our own national plans of the EU member states, but we should also be assisting others with their transition plans so that in that way we also prevent the gray and the black economy that also always follows situations of crisis and geopolitical turbulence where people or groups see the potential to profit. And you have to counter that with information and knowledge.
Perhaps one more question we may have time for.
Thank you very much.
Ask it.
I'm Nobuo Tanaka. I was the executive director of the International Energy Agency some time ago. My question to Mr. Gao, Dr. Gao, is that what is your view about the nuclear power as a part of the solution for the climate change mitigation? I know that Yuval Noah Harari mentioned about the risk for the human being, and two of the questions you have raised is already he mentioned. And another one is the risk of nuclear war. After Ukraine, in the Gaza, there's a critical situation about the possibility of nuclear wars is happening. So using the nuclear power as a peaceful or civil use, how you think about the design of the future sustainable nuclear power. Europe is doing a lot. Kazakhstan is a very important supplier of uranium. China has a building huge amount of nuclear, say, reactors. But still, we have to solve the issue of radioactive waste, safety by the small modular reactors. How can we stop the proliferation risk of nuclear weapon? North Korea has a weapon. Why not
It's a
Turkey? Why not Iran?
It's great. It's a great question. I'd love to put it to both Professor Gao and Minister Kyantarov as briefly as we can, because I know the time's up and there were more questions. Hadi, but please, Professor Gao.
Yeah. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Tanaka-san. I realize Tanaka-san and I have many mutual friends. And first of all, let me share with you one absolutely good news. China recently announced it has made a great breakthrough in one source of nuclear energy. It's thorium-based, molten salt-based new way of generating power. Now, unlike the traditional nuclear power, this thorium-based, molten salt-based nuclear power is absolutely safe. And it can be used extensively in civilian use. That means, I think I want to share this with you because this is something you need to follow. Other things being equal, if this development really continues, I think mankind will benefit tremendously from this new type of nuclear power, which is not dangerous as the traditional nuclear power. That's the good news. Now, the second thing I want to share is that ever since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, from the Chinese perspective, and the war means different things to different countries. From the Chinese perspective, China saw immediately the danger of nuclear escalation because never fool around with the country with the largest nuclear weapon arsenal. China was the only country in the world today which was threatened with nuclear wipeout, annihilation by the former Soviet Union in 1969. And China scrambled into action, did everything it could to eventually mitigate that threat from the former Soviet Union. Therefore, when China saw the war breaking out, involving Russia on the one hand and Ukraine on the other hand, and NATO behind Ukraine, China wanted to urge all parties involved to de-escalate, to cease fire, to call the war off. Why? Because if nuclear escalation really happens involving Ukraine, it will lead very rapidly to Armageddon, and all of us will become victims. Therefore, China has been doing the right thing, in my best judgment, calling for ceasefire and stopping the war, stopping supply more and more weapons to Ukraine. Eventually, any technical success that Ukraine may win on the battleground may actually aggregate further this danger of nuclear escalation. That's why I'm also calling for ceasefire and stopping the war. Whenever I can speak with the Ukrainians, and I visited Kyiv in July, they even give me a medal for promoting dialogue with Ukraine. I think it is time for us to figure out a way to end that war in Ukraine, because otherwise, if it really gets out of control, all of us will suffer the consequences. Thank you, Tanaka-san.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Just quickly, a last word, Minister, for you, perhaps, on the question of nuclear energy, very briefly, because we're running out.
Mr. Gao, I think was a very good question from you, sir. And you mentioned thorium as the future energy source, which will be more efficient than uranium. But at the same time, of course, I see the nuclear power used for peaceful purposes, for energy production, as one of the most efficient at the moment. The only thing is, of course, unfortunately, we had Chernobyl, we had Fukushima, unfortunately, but still we not have a substitute for the moment for the most efficient energy source. And our country, being the largest uranium producer of the world, 45% of global production, we still do not have a nuclear plant. This is an issue of our mindset, because during the Soviet times, our Semei region was used as a polygon. That's why it's sitting in the mindset. The same as I think Japanese have them in their mindset, being afraid of nuclear power. That's why we have not yet decided to build a nuclear power. But at the same time, we see it as one of the possible sources, going carbon neutral. That's why in a couple of years, we're going to have a referendum, and the people will decide whether to build a nuclear plant in our country. And just for your information, being a peaceful nation, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Kazakhstan and Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, Ukraine was also there in this list, were the only countries who voluntarily refused from the nuclear power that we had. And Kazakhstan had the number 4 nuclear power in the world. So we just refused, and we did not want to have to use a military nuclear power, but only for peaceful purposes. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you, Minister, Madam President, Professor Gao. It's been fascinating. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but thank you very much for being here today. Thank you.